In April of the year 1066, a strange sight in the heavens caused panic and alarm throughout much of Europe. What we now know to have been Halley's Comet was then called a long-haired star, but the ignorant and terrified inhabitants of Europe thought they were witness to a divine portent, heralding disaster and cataclysmic changes in the affairs of men. This time, they were to be proved right. Within 6 months, 2 of the most powerful monarchs in Western Europe were to lie slain on the battlefield. A third had begun the blood-stained rise, which was to give him mastery of England, the richest nation in Western Europe. He was known in his own time as William the Great, but to future generations, he would be better known by another name, William the Conqueror. From about the year 800 AD, a new and terrifying force had begun to make itself felt across the face of Europe. Sallying out from their Scandinavian homelands, wave after wave of sea raiders, Norwegians, Danes, and Swedes, voyaged in their longships to carry fire and sword through the prosperous lands of the Western world. This was the age of the Vikings. At first, they came in search of booty, plunder, and slaves, and the fury of the Norsemen was a bitterly experienced horror to the peoples of Britain, France, and most of the civilized world. In about 917 AD, one such group of raiders, led by a giant Norwegian called Rolf the Ganger, had been exiled by their ruler, the King of Norway. Rolf and his lawlessness, it seems, exceeded even the Norsemen's generous standards of tolerance. Rolf and his men must have been a desperate crew indeed. They boarded their longships and headed along the English Channel until they reached the French coast at the mouth of the River Seine. Before them lay a fertile countryside, filled with farms, churches, and prosperous towns. A land made to be plundered. In a series of devastating raids, Rolf and his men penetrated to the very gates of Paris. Finally, the King of France, Charles the Simple, sought peace. In desperation, he offered Rolf the title of Count and all the lands which lay between the river Acre and the sea. Rolf agreed, accepted Christianity, and the hand of the king's daughter in marriage. By doing so, he became the French king's uneasy vassal, and his followers and their families took possession of their new territory. The land of the Northmen had been born. Its name survives today as Normandy.
There's still a lot of debate over who exactly the Normans were, but when we're looking at this, we should consider what the Normans themselves thought. They saw themselves as a distinctly separate race, the gens Normanorum, they called themselves, the Norman people. They were a fierce people, an ambitious, restless people, yet with a love of order. Yet paradoxically, but perhaps not surprisingly considering their Viking ancestry, they were difficult to rule. Their ruler, whoever he was, had to have a strong hand and he could never relax.
During the next century, the new rulers of Normandy prospered. They became, for the most part, zealous Christians. The devastated towns, churches, and monasteries were rebuilt, and the Normans became all but French in speech and culture. But, scarcely concealed beneath this outward veneer, the Old Norse restlessness and love of adventure and battle remained. They had seen brutal times in the past, and even more horror lay in the future. It was into this fierce dynasty that the young William was born. The fact that he was illegitimate affected him psychologically throughout his life. However, illegitimacy carried no particular stigma in 11th century Normandy. His early childhood seems to have been spent in the obscurity of his unmarried mother's household. But at the age of about 6, he was propelled to the forefront of events. In 1034, after a lifetime spent fighting domestic and foreign enemies and governing his unruly duchy, William's father, Duke Robert of Normandy, suddenly announced his intention of going on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Before leaving, he called together his leading nobles and made a remarkable announcement. By my faith, it is not my will to leave you without a lord. I have a little bastard here who will grow, if God pleases, to be a gallant man. This is why I conjure you, by the duty you owe me, to revere him as your lord. There was nothing in Norman law or custom to prevent an illegitimate son from succeeding to the dukedom. And to make William's position more secure, Robert appointed a regency council of notables led by his brother, the Archbishop of Rouen. In this precaution at least, Robert's fears proved well-founded. In the summer of 1035, news reached Normandy that his father had died of a fever at Nicaea, in what is now Turkey. Not only had the Duke failed to set eyes upon the Holy City, but his dreams of a peaceful succession for his infant son would soon be in ruins. The hereditary violence of the Normans was about to be reawakened. Within a few months of the news of Duke Robert's death, his brother, the Archbishop of Rouen, died. Without his strong hand to guide its government, Normandy was plunged into bloody anarchy. One by one, the trusted lieutenants in whose care Duke Robert had left the infant William met violent ends at the hands of plotters and rebels. Alan, Count of Brittany, was poisoned. The young Duke's guardian, Gilbert of Brome, and Thorold, his tutor, were both brutally assassinated. The tide of violence was to engulf William himself in a horrifying way. One night, as he slept alongside his seneschal Osborne Crepon in his castle at Ventreuil, a party of rebels under Roger of Montgomery forced their way in. Osborne was viciously hacked to death. But the little boy, unnoticed in the frenzy, cowered undiscovered amid the bloody sheets. Who can tell how the traumatic event must have affected the mind of an impressionable 6-year-old? Maybe it was the horror which was to shape his own behavior. During these terrible days, Normandy tasted all the horrors of a medieval land without effective leadership. Throughout the realm, anarchy descended as its nobility rampaged unchecked. But as he grew into manhood, gradually the tide of events turned in William's favor. Wisely, he was able to surround himself with an efficient team of trusted advisors. And after a great deal of bloodshed, he re-established peace in Normandy. Duke William broke by iron the 2 arrogant heads, dismantled the ramparts of crime by victoriously capturing many castles, and this stopped for a long time the intestinal wars of our region. It was a battle worthy of memory for many centuries to come.
William, of course, is known as William the Bastard. He was the son of the previous Duke of Normandy and a washerwoman who took his attention. Came to the duchy in 1035 after a very turbulent youth, several attempts to assassinate him by various factions in the Norman scene. Therefore, he was very much a pragmatic man, a no-nonsense fellow, first to last.
During the fight to pacify his homeland, William had been noted for his generosity and lenient treatment of his enemies. But there were incidents which showed a darker side of his nature. Not surprisingly, it was his concern over his illegitimate birth which was to provide the spark. Once during the siege of Alençon, as William approached an enemy outpost, its defenders had hung from its walls as a protection against fire the hides of some newly slaughtered oxen. In a reference to William's illegitimate birth, they chanted derisively, "Hides, hides for the tanner." White with rage, the young Duke ordered his men to storm the outpost. Then the 32 survivors of the garrison were blinded, had their hands and feet struck off, and were catapulted over the walls into the besieged city as a grim warning to its defenders that they would suffer the same fate unless they surrendered, which they made haste to do. The ruthless side of the Duke's nature was to become even more apparent as the years went by. If his gains were to be secure, it was now time to think of marriage. His choice was made with political implications firmly to the forefront. He married Matilda, daughter of Count Baldwin of Flanders. No doubt their match was intended to help secure Normandy's northern borders. Remarkably for the age, and possibly reflecting his attitude towards illegitimacy, William appears to have remained faithful to Matilda for the rest of her life. She bore him a number of children, including 4 sons, 2 of whom, William and Henry, were to be kings of England. But it was not in the nature of either William or his subjects to remain for long at peace. Fighting continued with the duchy's neighbors, and in one such campaign in 1065, William was accompanied by a distinguished foreigner, Harold Godwinson, the second most powerful man in England after King Edward the Confessor. It was a visit which was to have the most profound implications for both men, and also for their countries.
There are a lot of ambiguities about William's claim to the English throne. He himself said that he had been promised it in 1051 by Edward the Confessor. But what is in fact not often realised is that the throne wasn't Edward's to offer. The English monarchy was elective, which meant that the successor was chosen by a council made up of the leading nobles and clergy. The most that Edward possibly offered William was some sort of vague assurances of goodwill. Now there are the same sort of problems regarding Harold's visit to Normandy in 1064 or 1065. We don't even know why he went there in the first place. One possibility is that he was sent as an emissary by Edward. What may have happened is that once in William's power, he was made to swear an oath giving his support to William's claim for the throne. But again, Harold was not in a position to make any such promise.
Whatever agreement William believed he had obtained from Harold, he was to be bitterly disillusioned. When news reached Normandy of Edward the Confessor's death on the 5th of January 1066, William expected to be offered the throne of England. Imagine then his rage at the announcement of Harold Godwinson's coronation as King of England. All the contemporary accounts speak of William's rage, so terrible that none dared approach him. Motivated perhaps as much by injured pride and the affront to his prestige as by any other reason, William was set on vengeance. If he was not to have the throne by popular assent, he would have it by force. As the summer of 1066 approached, all the furious Norman energy was employed in preparing to invade England and submit William's claims to trial by battle.
The main source of troops for William's invasion came from the Norman nobility, who had to supply him with men as part of the duty to their overlord. But he also recruited a significant number of mercenaries and volunteers from other places, notably France, Flanders and Brittany. These were drawn by hopes of land and booty. The main strength of the Norman army, based on the popular image of the Bayeux Tapestry, has always been thought to be its cavalry. And this is certainly true to a point. They were the main striking force of William's army. But also important were the infantry. There were spearmen, bowmen and crossbowmen. And these latter had an important role to play in the Normans' preferred tactics of combined arms warfare. The infantry would soften up the enemy and then the cavalry would be sent in for the kill. Norman preparations were on a vast scale. William is said to have built or collected together over 700 ships, a huge total for those times. And he was also active on the diplomatic front. For instance, he obtained the blessing of the Pope and was able to carry the papal banner at the head of his army. Now, this not only gave him some useful spiritual brownie points, it was also a useful safeguard at home. Any foreign enemies, of whom he had a large number, would hesitate to invade Normandy if they knew William had the Pope's backing.
William the Conqueror's army, which he was collecting in Normandy, ready to invade Britain, really comprised two main sections. First of all, there are those local Norman lords and magnates who owed him a certain amount of military service, possibly 40 days a year. He also applied for and received a great many mercenary applications from other knights and so forth who were at a loose end and literally came along for the loot, if you might say. Not particularly on the side of William, but he was paying them and he said there might well be rewards in Britain for them. So you have a lot of Bretons, you have other kinds of French knights as well, a few Germans even, who were in this very kind of polyglot army, although the basis of it was, of course, Normans, as you might suppose. Now, there are three sorts of soldiers. First of all, the knights, which we all think of from the Bayeux Tapestry, with their kite-shaped shields, their chainmail hauberks, and their lances. They were possibly about a couple of thousand of those. Then there were the foot soldiers and the archers, maybe 7,500 or so between them. When we say archers, we are talking about the short bow, of course, not the long bow of later generations. This was a far less devastating weapon, but a useful fire instrument to have at your disposal. The men-at-arms were equipped much the same as the knights, but fought only on foot. Over in England, it was a different situation from that in Normandy. Whereas the Normans now used their horses to fight on, as well as to move them to the battlefield, over the Channel in England we had the last of the Danish traditional type army organisations. Horses were very much used, yes, certainly, for the king and his thanes and his huscarls, but they were used only for mobility. They always dismounted to fight, as had done the Vikings and the Danes in the previous centuries. They had, of course, as by way of a separate weapon from what the Normans had, the feared battle axe. The great battle axes or the shield wall would be indeed a daunting thing to face at any time, whether on horseback or not. So the two armies which are going to meet at Hastings really represented two distinct types of military organisation. William, the mounted knight, with his great charges up the hill at Senlac and so forth, he represented the future. The great age of the knight in armour was about to begin and would last for the next 250 years or so. On the other hand, Harold's army represented the last of the old Danish, Norse-type armies, which always fought on foot, using their horses to get them to the battlefield, but then dismounting to form the famous shield wall and then fight it out with their battle axes.
William faced a formidable task in challenging the richest nation in Western Europe, led by one of its foremost soldiers. However, William was to be aided by events elsewhere, for he was not the only claimant to the English throne. In late September 1066, a powerful army led by King Harold Hardrada of Norway and Harold Godwinson's renegade brother Tostig landed in the north of England, defeated the local Saxon forces under Earls Edwin and Morcar, and occupied York. King Harold, who had been waiting on the south coast to meet the rumored Norman invasion, was forced to hasten north to counter this new, unexpected threat. Fatally, he also gave permission for the southern fyrd, the militia, to stand down in order to bring in the harvest. Moving with great speed, the English king confronted his northern foes at Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September and won a total victory. Hardrada and Tostig were killed, and scarcely pausing for breath, Harold and his household troops, the Huscarls, hurried south once again, for the terrifying news was out. The Norman invasion had begun. Sometime around September 27, the huge Norman armada of some 700 ships set sail from the estuary of the River Somme. Unopposed by the English fleet, they arrived off Pevensey early the following morning. The Norman forces disembarked unopposed and moved to occupy the easily defensible peninsula occupied by the town of Hastings, where the Norman army established its base camp. William did not want to risk marching on London while Harold remained undefeated. Instead, he ordered his men to devastate the surrounding countryside, rightly calculating that Harold would be stung into giving immediate battle. Harold wasted no time, arriving back in London on October 6th with the survivors of his Huscarls. The English king desperately gathered what men he could, and then, without waiting for reinforcements from the Midlands and the north, marched out to meet the Norman invader. Harold was also keenly aware that as well as being depleted in numbers, the bulk of his troops were distinctly inferior to most of William's men, especially the lightly armed and equipped fyrdsmen. The Saxons, therefore, took up a strong defensive position on Senlac Hill, where they barred the road to London and awaited the Norman onslaught.
And then Harold, in effect, said to William, "Come and get me. You want the kingdom? Here I am. Come and get me." Now, but saying that, of course, he was, in effect, handing the initiative over to Duke William. The form the battle would actually take and its successive stages then would be dictated by the Normans rather than by the Anglo-Saxons. And indeed, several of the chroniclers of the time speak of the way the shield wall stood as if rooted into the ground. This was going to be a fine, stalwart fight to the death. The chances of winning the Battle of Hastings were fairly limited because William could choose the tune and make the Anglo-Saxons dance to it.
As his army formed up for battle early on the morning of October 14, 1066, William must have known that at the age of 38, he was facing the supreme test of his military career. It is sometimes forgotten that hitherto the Duke had fought in only 2 major pitched battles, and his reputation as a general, though adequate, did not compare with that of his opponent, Harold Godwinson. Furthermore, a defeat would have dire consequences, for even if William were to survive and get back home to Normandy, he would be discredited and prey once more to his domestic and French enemies. None of these doubts showed, however, in the pre-battle speech which the Duke made to his commanders. "It is now that your arms must prove your strength and courage. If you fight like men, you will gain victory, honor, and wealth. Otherwise, you will be covered with eternal ignominy. No road is open for retreat. On one side, armed men and a hostile and unknown country bar your passage. On the other, the sea and other armed men are opposed to your flight. The courage of a small number of warriors may easily overcome a greater number of men unskilled in fighting, above all when the cause of justice is protected by divine aid. Let nothing stand in your way, and soon you will triumph." The battle opened with an attack on the English position by William's archers and crossbowmen. They made little impression, and a general assault by the remainder of William's infantry was met by a hail of slingshot, small axes, and javelins.
At Hastings, it was a combination of archers and these mounted warriors that finally defeated the shield wall of Harold and the Anglo-Saxons at Senlac. The Norman cavalry were heavily equipped with hauberks of mail, with long kite-shaped shields, with lance and sword. They rode superbly bred and trained war horses. These horses, unafraid of the noise of battle, were fighters in their own right. We have a description of William's own horse trampling on people at Hastings. The knights would ride knee to knee in a charge, put in groups of 3 or 4, and they had great tactical flexibility. The key weapon of the knight was the lance, deployed in a shock tactic. The knight would couch his lance under his arm, bring his shield up for protection, feet in long stirrups, high-backed saddle, and together a group of Normans would charge with a great shock impetus whenever they struck a static line of infantry. One contemporary, speaking about the Franks on the First Crusade, said, "The charge of the Normans is irresistible. It could bore its way through the walls of Babylon." The Norman knight was the tank of the 11th and 12th century.
With the battle deadlocked, William committed his cavalry, but, hindered by the sloping ground and the English shield wall, many knights and their chargers were hacked down by Harold's formidable axemen and could not penetrate the English line. And now, some of William's men, probably the Bretons on his left wing, broke and fled, and the panic began to spread to the rest of the Norman line. Some of the English ran forward in pursuit, and a rumor began to spread that William had been killed. It was a moment of crisis, but William was equal to the occasion. Pushing back his helmet from his face and roaring with the full strength of his powerful lungs, William, seized by one of his famous rages, cried out to his troops, "Look at me, all of you. I still live, and with God's help I will conquer. What folly has driven you to flight? If you flee, not one of you will escape death."
Well, up to this point, the battle had been going quite well for Harold. His men were still holding the ridge-top position, and they'd thrown back everything that William could send against them. Furthermore, the day was drawing on, and William was in the position whereby if he didn't win the battle by the end of the day, he wasn't going to win it at all. It was at this point that the Normans carried out the famous feigned retreats. There's been a lot of debate about these. Were they deliberate, or were they just accidents that William was able to take advantage of? Quite a large number of Harold's less disciplined troops charged down the slope in pursuit, were cut off and wiped out. But the battle was still not won. The best of Harold's men, including the famous Huscarls, its personal bodyguard, was still in position on the ridge-top, and the shield wall was still intact.
Aided by his half-brother, the fearsome mace-wielding Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, William rallied his men and cut down the pursuing Saxons. Though the immediate crisis was over, the battle was far from won.
By about midday, the Battle of Hastings had reached a rather parlous situation, perhaps for both sides. Harold had lost the whole right wing third, which had charged down and been butchered by the Normans, who turned round, having deliberately lured them into a premature attack in that way. But as far as the Normans were concerned, although that was obviously a plus, yet the battle was yet far from won, and it was absolutely necessary that a decision should be reached within that day before sunset. They had nowhere to fall back upon. Their morale would plummet if they didn't win the battle on this first day, and they would probably face, therefore, total disaster. Therefore, the battle is not yet won, but every incentive is now for William to fling all his remaining resources into this battle. The Anglo-Saxon line was battered. It had no right flank now, but still there was this formidable line of the shield wall with their battle axes waving threateningly over the top of it, and so everything was yet to be gained or lost.
William at this point changed his tactics. He ordered his archers to advance and fire a barrage of arrows at close range. Now these really began to tear gaps in the English line. It was probably at this point that Harold was struck down, quite likely by the famous arrow in the eye, which is now normally accepted as probably being an authentic incident. His brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, were already dead, and as a result the English command structure started to break down and morale began to crack. As gaps appeared in the line, the Norman cavalry were unleashed, forced their way through and began to hack down the isolated groups of Englishmen. It was also probably at this point that the mortally wounded Harold was finished off.
With King Harold lying dead at the foot of his standard, William had won his greatest victory. Whatever his skills as a general, it is clear that the Duke had been an inspiring leader of his men in battle.
It was always customary for medieval chroniclers to magnify the role of leaders in battle, but William seems to have carried out both of the roles expected of him with great success. He was in the thick of the fighting, inspiring his men, and yet he also was able to keep control of his army overall and direct their operations in a coherent fashion. It's true to say that without William, the Normans would not have won the Battle of Hastings.
Harold was dead, Duke William clearly triumphant and de facto King of England. Trial by battle, as religious men regarded it at the time, had now decided once and for all the question of the succession to Edward the Confessor. The whole future, indeed, of these islands was going to be irremediably affected by the outcome of this battle, which must be certainly one of the most significant moments in the history of these islands.
William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066. It was noted that William was visibly trembling. If so, it was one of the few occasions in his life when he apparently showed fear. That fear may have been apprehension, because William was well aware that his conquest of England had only just begun. Even though many of the leading magnates had submitted, the English people, for the most part, remained defiant. If they had glimpsed the full horror of what was to follow, they may well have chosen not to resist the Norman invader. At first, all was relatively civilized. The new king made a brief progress through the territory under his control, and with characteristic thoroughness, set his men to work to extend and consolidate their gains.
Following 1066, William's task was clear. He somehow had to rivet Norman control on a country that was in a state of political flux. He also had to watch his back in Normandy, and one of the first things he does in 1067 is to go on a triumphal progress back to the duchy, leaving key lieutenants in charge of castles such as Dover, Hastings, Pevensey. But he takes with him the leading Anglo-Saxon magnates virtually as political hostages. And we have an account from a Norman chronicler who says that in Rouen, the Normans marvelled to see these prisoners brought with their long hair, their wonderful clothes, fabulously adorned filigree work of their Saxon ornaments. This was a triumphal progress. But William couldn't remain in Normandy very long. He distributed gifts, made sure that his control of the duchy was secure against his French enemies, against the Count of Anjou, the King of France, Count of Flanders, and then quickly returned to re-establish his authority.
The Normans in England were few in numbers, perhaps no more than 10,000 in all, and so depended upon a network of castles to overawe and control the conquered English. Many of these structures still scatter the English landscape today.
What the Normans did, they would build a castle, often by requisitioned Saxon labour. There's a deep irony there that the Saxons are forced to build the very mechanisms of their own oppression. But from that, they used the castles as a springboard for further conquest. They would build a castle within, let's say, 15 miles of the next one, the operating radius of horsemen in a day's ride. And then from that castle, they would take a further area of territory, consolidate with the castle, and move on. By the death of William the Conqueror in 1087, England was literally studded with castles. Probably by the year 1100, there are over 1,000 modern Bailey castles in Britain.
The promises which William had made to respect English rights and laws were quickly forgotten. Those who had fought at Hastings and the families of those slain had their lands confiscated or had to make heavy payments in gold to the Norman victors. It seems clear that William himself was as guilty of abuse as any of his followers. His greed for gold was proverbial, especially among the conquered English. To the Norman barons, whose rapacious Viking ancestry was still very much in their blood, the riches of England presented a temptation impossible to resist. They were a restless, drunken, and emotional society, dazzled with the prospect of unaccustomed wealth. William, at least initially, seems to have succumbed along with the rest. And as well as greed, he was now to gain a steadily growing reputation for ruthlessness. Not surprisingly, the next few years saw a flood of uprisings against the rule of the hated Normans. One such rebellion took on a serious new dimension in January 1069, when William's new overlord in the north was surprised at Durham and slaughtered along with 900 Normans. This was a major disaster for the Normans. Of even more concern was a new wave of insurrection throughout the country. William's hold on England seemed to be hanging by a thread, but he responded with a ferocity which has echoed down the ages. Striking first at Edric the Wild's rebels in the Midlands, William then led his troops north in a savage and whirlwind campaign. King William was determined to break the power of the North once and for all. In order to do this, he was prepared to use the most brutal methods.
In 1069, William the Conqueror faced the greatest threat to his rule so far, a coalition of the King of Scots, the King of Denmark, who sent a fleet which entered the Ouse estuary, a rising of the Northern Earls, outbreaks in Wales and the South Countries. William's response was short and brutal. His army entered Yorkshire, laying waste, killing and burning whatever he could find. Crops were garnered together and systematically burnt. Ploughs, instruments of agricultural production were destroyed in order to create an artificial famine. Those who escaped the Norman swords died of slow starvation. The chronicler records that the streets and houses lay empty, the fields littered with bodies, and there was no one left alive to bury them.
It has been estimated that the ravaging of the north, which extended across the counties of Yorkshire, Derbyshire, Staffordshire, Cheshire, and Shropshire, cost the lives of between 5 and 10% of the total population of England, and caused a devastation whose effects were still visible 60 years later. Despite the horrors, the period after the conquest saw a great resurgence in religious activity in England. For example, building work went on great cathedrals like Durham, Canterbury, and Gloucester, and the monasteries flourished, a kind of uneasy peace settled on the land. Though stern beyond measure to those who opposed his will, William was kind to those good men who loved God. On the very spot where God granted him the conquest of England, he caused a great abbey to be built, and he settled monks in it, and richly endowed it. During his reign was built the great cathedral at Canterbury, and many another throughout all England. The land was filled with monks living their lives after the rule of St. Benedict. Such was the state of religion in his time that every man who wished to, whatever considerations there might have been with regard to their rank, could follow the profession of monk. William had made the English church administratively efficient, but he had also made it Norman. In their spiritual lives, as in every other aspect of their existence, the English people was subject to their foreign overlords. William also established his rule of law over England, and made a rudimentary use of what was later to become the jury system. But once again, it was a justice very much designed to protect the position of the conquerors. It was said that in William's reign, any man might travel over the kingdom with a bosom full of gold, unmolested. But anyone fortunate enough to have possessed such wealth would undoubtedly have been speaking Norman French. In 1080, a threat of renewed Danish invasion and the need to pay large numbers of continental mercenaries drew attention to the lack of any accurate record of the wealth of England and who exactly held its lands. This was a situation which William, with his avarice and energy, could not allow to continue. At Christmas, 1085, grown, we are told, immensely fat, and with a harsh, commanding voice, William called his council together and decided what to do. The result was to be the Great Survey, later called with wry humor by the English, the Domesday Book. It was the most thorough land survey which had ever been carried out, and it was done with amazing speed and efficiency. King William sent his men all over England, into every shire, to ascertain how many hundreds of hides of land there were in each shire, and how much land and livestock the king himself owned in the country, and what annual dues were lawfully his from each shire. He also had it recorded how much land his archbishops had, and his diocesan bishops, his abbots, and his earls, and what or how much each man who was a landholder here in England had in land and livestock, and how much money it was worth. So very thoroughly did he have the inquiry carried out that there was not a single hide, nor one vergate, not even, it is shameful to record it, but it did not seem harmful to him to do it, one ox or one cow or pig, which escaped his survey. As William grew older, his relationship with his eldest son Robert had deteriorated. Robert had been named as William's heir for the dukedom of Normandy, and as the years went by, he grew impatient to take up his inheritance. William was dismissive of his son's demands, remarking, "It is not my custom to take off my clothes before I go to bed." In the summer of 1086, reports reached King William that Robert was plotting with King Philip of France to invade Normandy. And though now almost 60 years of age, immensely stout, and in deteriorating health, William crossed to the duchy to meet this new threat. At the end of July 1087, William's troops stormed the city of Nantes and put it to the torch. Riding exultantly through the burning streets, William was either struck by a seizure in the immense heat, or was thrown by his stumbling mount with great force against the iron pommel of his saddle. He suffered a fatal internal injury. The dying king was carried back to Rouen, where he lingered in great pain for 6 weeks. William sensed the end was near, and with typical pragmatism, began settling his affairs. William, with great reluctance, confirmed his errant son Robert in his longed-for Normandy. His second son, William Rufus, was to become King of England. In his 60 years, William had risen from obscurity, secured his dukedom against internal and external foes, and conquered the richest land in Western Europe, bringing to it a harsh and ordered government, such as it had never previously known. But now, William was at last faced by death, the greatest foe of all, and one whom even he could not defeat. On the morning of September 9th, 1087, as the great bell of the Minster of Rouen tolled, the fierce old warrior breathed his last. A monk from William's own abbey, though writing 200 years later, has left an account of the conqueror's tormented words of guilt and anguish, which may well serve as his most fitting epitaph, especially in the eyes of his English subjects. I persecuted the native inhabitants of England beyond all reason. Whether nobles or commons, I cruelly oppressed them. Many I unjustly disinherited. Innumerable multitudes, especially in the county of York, perished through me by famine and sword. I tremble when I reflect on the grievous sins which burden my conscience. And now, about to be summoned before the most awful tribunal of God, I know not what I ought to do. I was bred to arms from my childhood, and am stained with the rivers of blood that I have shed.
On the 28th of June, 1381, during the 4th year of the reign of King Richard II, the last courageous remnants of an army of simple peasants met its sad end. They had been forced into open rebellion against the king by the imposition of the pernicious poll tax. Now, only 3 weeks later, they had been slaughtered by the king's army, and their dreams of justice lay shattered with the broken bodies in the fields of Billericay. The peasants' revolt was over. The great popular rising of the people during the Middle Ages is known to history as the Peasants' Revolt. This name, though not strictly accurate, captures perfectly the spirit of the rebellion, for it was an explosion of public rage against unfair, overbearing authority and unjust suppressive laws. Moreover, it was not merely simple peasants who took up arms in a dramatic attempt to overthrow the cruel, back-breaking feudal system and the despised poll tax. Many parish priests, labourers, artisans and small traders risked everything to give the Great Rebellion their full support. So what were the extraordinary circumstances which led the ordinary citizens of England to open revolt? Why were these simple folk prepared to spill their blood and risk their necks in a do-or-die attempt to improve their wretched lives? Trouble had undoubtedly been brewing in England for several years prior to the spectacular events of 1381. England's great monarch, Edward III, had finally died aged 64 on the 21st of June 1377, after a reign of over 50 years. Although his death presented the opportunity for a new start, there was also a general sense of unease, for Edward's reign had provided a continuity which had now gone, and the future was unsure. Edward's eldest son, Edward, known as the Black Prince, had died in 1376, and the king had been succeeded by his grandson, the 10-year-old Richard II. Richard had been born in Gascony in France, and had been brought to England in 1371, where he was groomed for eventual kingship. But the death of his father and grandfather brought him the crown unexpectedly early. A minority kingship presented a serious problem for the English throne in 1377, for there were great rifts within the royal family and a badly divided nobility. The natural candidate for the regency was John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster. However, he was an ambitious fellow, and his past misdeeds meant he was clouded in suspicion. Therefore, no regent was appointed, but a continual council was set in place to advise the king's ministers and decide on policy. In 1379, the council had to resolve the problems of a battered economy and, most important, how to finance the continuing war with France, which was crippling the country. The war with France continued on and off for decades, and its spiraling cost was imposing a greater and greater strain on the nation's purse. The King's Council had an answer to the problem. It was simply to impose a new tax upon the already hard-pressed people of England. The poll, or head tax, required each citizen over the age of 15 years to pay 1 shilling to the treasury. To these people, some of them the poorest of the poor, it was a heartbreaking, cruel tax. For they laboured daily under the effects of the feudal system, which drained their every resource, and this latest imposition was the last straw.
In 1348-9, the Black Death hit England and wiped out between a third and a half of the entire population. And for the peasants that were left, this meant an enormous degree of pressure. First of all, from the lords of their manors, who wanted to maintain the standards of living they had had before the plague, and who insisted that the peasants should work that much harder on the fields in order to compensate for those who had died. And at the same time, the king was putting additional pressure on all his subjects to pay for a series of disastrous wars in France, which culminated in the demand for the poll tax of 1380, 12 pence per head on every adult in the population, equivalent to 3 days' wages for a skilled person. And when commissioners were sent out into the shires in the summer of 1381 to investigate the way in which the poll tax had been administered, the people simply revolted.
The feudal system had been introduced into England by the Normans after their conquest of the country in 1066. The system was one of devolved power, from God and the king, through lords and vassals, right down to the lowest and the last recipient of feudal rights, the peasant, called a serf or villein. The villein was tied to the soil owned by his lord. He was the head of his family and was linked with other peasants in the community or village with a group share in the grazing rights and access to communal woodland. He worked as many hours as were necessary to produce a good, healthy crop or produce good dairy stock. However, neither he or his family ever saw the full fruits of their labours, for the lord charged a rent for the land the villein worked and lived on. This rent took the form of money or surplus produce, or perhaps even forced labour on other estates. During the later part of the 14th century, the finances of the landowners were becoming more and more strained as demands on the land were increased. As a consequence, the local bailiffs were ordered to obtain more produce from the peasants and to clear larger areas of land to grow crops. They were also ordered to raise rents and apply fines for slow payment. Under this pitiless regime, much of the peasant class were close to starving as they were forced to forgo food so that rents could be met. More and more serfs were ordered to carry out forced labour by increasingly violent methods. Nonetheless, the picture was not all unremitting gloom. There were exceptions to the general trend towards poverty. By 1381, the peasant class themselves were divided. There was a new class of peasant who had managed to sell their produce at local markets at a profit. These families had been able to meet their rent demands and build up their own small businesses and even buy their own land. Despite this, however, they were still serfs and liable to taxes levied at their lord's discretion. They had to pay to bake their bread in the lord's oven. They had to pay for the grinding of their corn. If the son of a serf sought a job away from the manor, he had to pay for the right, and even death came at a price, as a corpse could be fined by both the lord and the priest. Added to these existing privations, the poll tax naturally came as a crippling blow to the villein and his family. Many were fined for non-payment, and many tried to run away, but they were caught and forced to toil on the land without hope of breaking free. In this time of unhappiness and discontent, there were those who, despite the threat of severe punishments, spoke out extolling the virtues of a new society. The church was charged with keeping the minds and spirits of the peasants under control, but there were some among them who saw the injustices upon the common people and worked hard for change. One such man was John Ball, who was originally from St. Mary's in York but settled in Colchester. Ball had been the chaplain of St. James, but when he was denounced by the Archbishop, thereby losing his position, he continued to work from Colchester, preaching against the rich men and the lords. He attacked tithes and serfdom, assuring the peasantry that it was possible to bring about a different and better world.
By the time the Peasants' Revolt broke out, John Ball already had had a long career as a radical preacher in the home counties area, and his popularity with his audiences had already got him into a lot of trouble with church authorities during the 1360s and the 70s, and he had been in and out of prison several times as a result of the radical nature of his teachings. At the time that the rebels rose in Kent, he was actually imprisoned by the Archbishop of Canterbury in Maidstone, and they released him from there. He then marched to Blackheath with the rebels of Kent and preached there a very remarkable and radical sermon, which undoubtedly fired the people present and encouraged them on to take the city of London itself.
In 1366, Archbishop Langham excommunicated Ball, and in April 1381 he was imprisoned upon the orders of Archbishop Sudbury. But the words and letters of John Ball were instrumental in fueling the defiance of the people. One contemporary chronicle tells of a sermon Ball gave in the marketplace in Kent.
My good friends, matters cannot go well in England until all be held in common. When there shall be neither vassals nor lords, when the lords shall be no more masters than ourselves. How ill they behave to us! For what reason do they hold us in bondage? Are we not all descended from the same parents, Adam and Eve? And what can they show, or what reason can they give, why they should be more masters than ourselves? They are clothed in velvet and rich stuffs, ornamented with ermine and other furs, while we are forced to wear poor clothing. They have wine, spices, and fine bread, while we have only rye. And when we drink, it must be water. They have handsome seats and manners, while we must brave the wind and the rain in our labours in the fields. And it is by our labours that they have the wherewithal to support their pomp. We are called slaves. And if we do not perform our service, we are beaten, and we have no sovereign to whom we can complain. Let us go to the king and remonstrate with him. He is young, and from him we may obtain a favourable answer. And if not, we must ourselves seek to amend the conditions.
Despite the tangible unrest which gripped the country, the government seemed completely unaware of the implications of imposing the poll tax and concerned themselves only with raising the required revenue. It was upon receipt of the first poll tax returns that they received their first inkling that all was not well, for the document made interesting reading. Apparently, the population of England had fallen by over 500,000 people in only 5 years. The tax was levied on single people over the age of 15, and married couples paid only one tax. By all accounts, the country now seemed to consist entirely of married men and women with children under the age of 15. Obviously, falsified returns had been received in their thousands. The treasurer, Robert Hales, was, however, singularly unamused. Recognizing an attempt to defraud the government on a mass scale, he took the figures to the council. They lost no time in obtaining the king's permission to set about revising the returns. Another small step on the road to open revolt had been taken. It was in the spring of 1381 that a commissioner of the poll tax, Thomas Bampton, left London and made his way to Brentwood in Essex. His task was simply to revise the taxation returns that were suspected of being falsified. To help him in his work, Bampton had with him a clerk and a sergeant-at-arms, and he certainly had no inkling of the danger that lay ahead. Throughout England, other commissioners were hard at work, revising poll tax returns on the orders of the King's Council. Bampton began his inquiry on the 30th of May by ordering the folk of the marshland villages of Fobbing, Corringham and Stanford-le-Hope to appear before him at Brentwood. The peasants and the fishermen of Fobbing certainly turned up in great numbers, but not with their caps in hand. Unfortunately for Bampton, They came bearing weapons, flatly refusing to pay a penny more in taxation. In fact, their spokesman, Thomas Baker, was so defiant that Bampton commanded his sergeants to arrest him. Almost at once, the furious villagers turned on the official party, beating them with sticks and throwing mud and stones at them to drive them out of Brentwood. Bampton, the steward of a powerful lord, was utterly astounded at such savage treatment. He returned without delay to London to report to the King's Council. But even then, the councillors were unable to grasp the strength of the general anger against the poll tax. Arrogantly, they decided that the riot was merely an isolated incident, which would be dealt with ruthlessly as an example to other malcontents. And so Sir Robert Belknap, the Chief Justice of the Common Pleas, was sent to root out and punish the rioters of Brentwood. However, the men of Fobbing and Corringham had not been idle. For them there was no turning back. The call to arms was sounded, and men from all around began to sharpen their axes and knives, their scythes and their spears in preparation for the fight. Large groups of men collected at Brentwood, Baddow and Colchester. These determined bands quickly organized themselves, taking experienced soldiers or local officials as their leaders. As the men mustered, messengers were sent into the countryside of southern Essex with a rallying cry. The time for action had come. The peasants' revolt had truly begun. Messages were received from London and Kent, offering their support in the fight against the King's Council and the officials trying to collect the hated poll tax. Indeed, the news of the rising in Essex was so well received that the men of Kent were already beginning to arm themselves. Of course, the unfortunate Belknap arrived in Brentwood with his retainers and his clerks, blissfully unaware of the angry reception that awaited him. He was instantly seized by the incensed mob, and his soldiers were disarmed and badly beaten. Now, in fear of his life, he swore upon the Bible that he would never hold legal sessions in respect of the poll tax again. Satisfied by this official capitulation, the rioters allowed the terrified Belknap to slink back to London unharmed. News of the events at Brentwood spread like wildfire throughout Essex. Now, in the fields and lanes, the marketplaces and the churchyards, local leaders whipped the peasantry into a rebellious frenzy against the poll tax. United in their determination to refuse the tax and brandishing their makeshift weapons, they attacked their landlords and the tax collectors. Now, with their blood up, the Kentish rebels marched to Rochester, where they joined up with a group of rebels from Gravesend. These men were protesting loudly at the imprisonment in Rochester Castle of one of their own townsmen, a man called Robert Belling. They were determined to free the imprisoned man. This was not an easy task, however, for Rochester Castle was under the command of the formidable Sir John Newton, who had absolutely no intention of releasing any prisoner to a lawless mob of commoners. With Newton was a garrison of trained and armed men, whom he believed would do him justice as he planned the defence of the castle. So it was that on the 6th of June, the rebel army formed up into companies according to their plan of battle and waited for the order to attack. This was to be the first real test of its military ability. But the enthusiasm and commitment of the rebels was such that anything seemed possible. At first their attacks failed, but the vigour and ferocity of the final assault carried the rebels into the castle, and the garrison finally capitulated. Once inside the castle, they broke open the dungeons, releasing all prisoners, including Robert Belling, and plundered the castle for what booty they could find. The whole mob, now several thousand strong, marched on up the Medway and to Maidstone, which had been captured by the People's Army. All along the route, the rebels destroyed the hated tax records. The revolt was now unstoppable, and so the rebels chose to make Maidstone their headquarters. It was here that the rebels held a meeting to elect an overall commander of their army. The man they chose was to become synonymous with the peasants' revolt. His name was Wat Tyler, and he became the official leader of the rebel army on the 7th of June 1381. There is little doubt that Tyler was a strong and charismatic figure who captivated the rebels in the makeshift army.
Wat Tyler is one of those very enigmatic figures in history. What we know about him, essentially, is what he did in the Peasants' Revolt. And prior to that, we know virtually nothing about him. He probably came from Essex, lived in or around Chelmsford, and he may have been a tiler, as his name suggests. That means that he was part of the building trade. But he emerges in the course of the Peasants' Revolt. And we only know for sure that he had emerged as the leader of the peasants towards the end of the time. In fact, on the second occasion that the rebels in London met with the King, Richard II, at Smithfield. And there is a suggestion that by this stage, what had happened was that a large number of the rebels had already actually disappeared home, and that Tyler was the leader of a radical group left in London. And the sort of demands that he made of the king in that second meeting at Smithfield would certainly suggest a growing influence by this radical element, demanding a complete change in the judicial system, radical reforms of the land law, remissions from all their taxes and from all their obligations, and the disestablishment of the church. Wat Tyler was a very remarkable man, but he lost his life as a result of the fact that he dared to stand up to the king and treat him as an equal.
A story has been passed down the years which could involve the leader of the rebel army. No one is really sure of the identity of the Tyler in the narrative. Being at work in the same time tiling of a house, when he heard thereof of the tax collecting, caught his lathing staff in his hand and ran riotously home. Where, reasoning with the collector who made him so bold, the collector answered with stout words and strake at the Tyler. Whereupon the Tyler, avoiding, smote the collector with the lathing staff, that the brains flew out of his head. Whereupon great noise arose in the street, and the poor people being glad, every one prepared to support the said Tyler. Was this Wat Tyler? No one will ever know, but it is clear that under Tyler, the rebel army marched with discipline and cohesion. That he was able to bring such order to his men, that such small pillage was done in the country, that the rebel army achieved what it did, are all massive testaments to the ability of Tyler. The course of events over the next few days are recorded perfectly by the anonymous Chronicle of St. Mary's in York.
And on the Monday next, after Trinity Sunday, they came to Canterbury before the hour of noon. And 4,000 of them, entering into the minster at the time of High Mass, there made a reverence and cried with one voice to the monks to prepare to choose a monk for Archbishop of Canterbury. For he who is Archbishop is a traitor, and shall be decapitated for his iniquity. And when they had done this, they went into the town to their fellows, and with one assent they summoned the mayor, the bailiffs, and the commons of the said town, and examined them whether they would with good will swear to be faithful and loyal to King Richard and the true commons of England or no. Then the mayor answered that they would do so willingly, and they made their oath to that effect. Then they, the rebels, asked them if they had any traitors among them. And the townsfolk said that there were 3, and named their names. These 3 the commons dragged out of their houses, and cut off their heads. And afterwards they took 500 men of the town with them to London, and the rest were left to guard the town.
On the 11th and 12th of June, the rebel army marched to the outskirts of London, gathering more and more willing recruits as they went. As they neared the city, there was an unexpected and dramatic meeting with the king's mother, Joan of Kent, the widow of the Black Prince, who had been with a retinue on a pilgrimage to the Kentish shrines. She was now hurrying back to the safety of the strong walls of the Tower of London. The fact that she was so late in returning, despite the growing disturbances, is a further indication that still the government failed to appreciate the gravity of the situation. When Joan and her attendants encountered the host of roughly armed peasants, they surely must have feared the worst. But to their surprise and relief, they suffered nothing worse than jostling and coarse comments. After a brief period of peaceful arrest, the leaders of the group gave orders for the party to be released, and they were allowed to proceed unmolested and unplundered. And so, while parts of his kingdom burned and his enraged subjects rampaged through towns and cities, the young King Richard remained within the Tower of London in a state of almost total inertia. This was not altogether surprising, for the young king had been very poorly advised by his councillors, whose prevarication and indecision allowed many legitimate military opportunities to slip by. For the fact was that the council lacked an experienced military man, a man with the necessary knowledge to present a solution to an increasingly difficult situation. John of Gaunt, whose advice would have been invaluable, was away in Edinburgh. Edmund of Cambridge had recently sailed to Portugal, and Richard's uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, was lying idle in the Welsh marshes. The King's Council was comprised of men such as Archbishop Sudbury, who actually asked to be released from his duties when he was informed that the rebels were marching on London, and Hales, the treasurer, who could offer only words of hatred for the peasants as his contribution towards a solution to the crisis.
During the early years of his reign, Richard II had had a series of regency councils appointed for him by Parliament, but the last of those had been dissolved the year before the Peasants' Revolt, and so far as we know, Richard, although he was only 14 at the time, was already ruling in his own full authority. But it's also quite clear that those who rose up against his government in 1381 were very well aware of who the important individuals were within his government and his council. The person that they hated most undoubtedly was his uncle, John of Gaunt. And had John of Gaunt been present in London in 1381, it's quite possible that he would have lost his life. But fortunately for him, he was away dealing with matters in the north of England. Therefore, it was the members of the King's administration who became the real focus for the rebels and their hatred in the summer of 1381. Particularly the King's two chief ministers, Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Chancellor, the top man in the government, and Robert Hales, the Treasurer, the man in charge of finance, the man, therefore, in charge of the poll tax. The way in which the rebels were able to storm the Tower of London and remove these men by force and put them to death on Tower Hill indicates the kind of paralysis that had developed in the court and the council at this moment of crisis, and the way in which, in effect, the rebels had actually taken command of the nation.
Despite this, the council did eventually manage to take some action by deciding not to send reinforcements to garrisons in Brittany. By doing this, they at least managed to retain a few score men-at-arms and archers under the old campaigner Sir Robert Knollys. Along with the 600 retainers of the king's household, they provided the royal party with their only military force. There was, however, one man of action in the royal household, one man who was capable of obstructing the progress of the rampant rebel army. His name was William Walworth, the Lord Mayor of London. Walworth sent out a deputation of citizens, comprising John Horne, Adam Carlyle, and John Fresh, to warn the rebel host not to approach London, which they assured them would be defended to the death. However, the treacherous John Horne succeeded in separating himself from the deputation and managed to speak directly to Wat Tyler. He told him to disregard the deputation's threat and to advance on London with all speed, where he would find the people of London ready to support the rebellion. Horne stayed with the rebels until night fell, and then smuggled 3 of them into the city, where he sheltered them in his house. There they met the leaders of the London commoners, and the final plans were laid for the rebels' great entry into London. The anonymous chronicles take up the story.
And on the vigil of Corpus Christi Day, the commons of Kent came to Blackheath, 3 leagues from London, to the number of 50,000, to wait for the king. and they displayed 2 banners of St. George and 40 pennons. And the commons came to the other side of the water to the number of 60,000 to aid them and to have their answer from the king. And on the Wednesday, the king, being in the Tower of London, thinking to settle the business, had his barge got ready, and took with him in the barge the archbishop and the treasurer and certain others of his council, and 4 other barges, and got him to Greenwich, which is 3 leagues from London. But there, the chancellor and the treasurer said to the king that it would be too great a folly to trust himself among the commoners, for they were men without reason, and had not the sense to behave properly.
As the king's barge carried him away, shouts of treason echoed all round. Now Wat Tyler, at the head of his army, gave the order to advance and take London. As the host moved into Southwark and approached London Bridge, they were met by John Horne, who was waving a standard with the royal arms which he had gained from the town clerk by false pretences. He called to the men to advance on, for they would be welcomed by the common people of London. Horne was correct in his assumption, for as the rebel army advanced on London Bridge, an alderman named Walter Sibyl lowered the drawbridge and opened the city gates, urging the rebels on into the city. The rebels, some 30,000 strong, poured across the bridge and into London's narrow streets. At the same time, on the other side of the city, William Tongue opened the Old Gate, thus allowing the Essex rebels, led by Thomas Farringdon and Jack Straw, to take the north of London in a sudden and unexpected rush. Despite the speed of the assault and the high state of excitement of the men, there was no unnecessary damage or plundering, exactly as Tyler had ordered.
At this time, the commons took their way through the middle of London and did no harm until they came to Fleet Street. And in Fleet Street, the men of Kent broke open the prison of the Fleet and turned out all the prisoners and let them go whither they would. And they went to the temple to destroy the tenants of the said temple, and they cast the houses to the ground and threw off all the tiles and left the roofing in a bad way. And then they went toward the Savoy, and set fire to divers houses of unpopular persons on the western side. And at last they came to the Savoy and broke open the gates and entered into the place. They took all the torches they could find, and burnt all the sheets and coverlets and beds and headboards of great worth, for their value was estimated at 1,000 marks. And they burnt the hall and the chambers and all the buildings within the gates of the said manor. And it is said they found 3 barrels of gunpowder, and thought it was silver, and cast into the fire, and the powder exploded and set the hall a greater blaze, to the great loss of the Duke of Lancaster.
Clearly, the King's Council now found itself in an impossible situation. It was the Earl of Salisbury who suggested that the King should attempt to appease the rebels by promising them exactly what they wanted, but that the promises should be made falsely. After much discussion within the council, this plan of action was agreed, and the king sent word into the street that the peasants' demands for justice would be considered and that they should return to their homes. Understandably, this message was met with total scorn, and the peasants shouted back their reply, calling for freedom from servitude, a pardon for all rebels, freedom to trade, and the right to own land at fixed prices. In addition, the mob demanded that traitorous members of the government be handed over to them for execution. The peasants' response threw the council into more confusion. They were now fully aware of the fate that would await them should the rebellion succeed. King Richard was advised to try once more to appease the rebels, and so he had a bill prepared, which was sent out into the streets to be read by 2 knights in his service. However, the response of the crowd to Richard's proclamation was unequivocal. The cries of mockery told the King's Council all they needed to know. Their feeble attempt to placate the peasants had failed. Now only one course of action was open to them. The king would have to meet the rebels face to face and personally hear their demands. And so word was sent that King Richard II would meet Wat Tyler the following day at Mile End, a place about 2 miles from the Tower of London, close to the rebel camp. So, on Friday the 14th of June at 7 a.m., the king left the Tower and made his way to Mile End. With the king were many of the senior nobles of the land, including Warwick, Oxford, Kent, Thomas Percy, Richard Percy, and Walworth. However, two men were conspicuous by their absence: Sudbury, whose offer of resignation had been refused, and Hales. Both remained in the Tower for fear of their lives. When the royal party finally reached Mile End, Tyler and his party moved forward and immediately entered into the business of the day. They made two requests: that the king allow the rebels to seize those they considered to be traitors and execute them, and that the king should at once grant the petitions and demands which Tyler held in his hands. However, Richard refused to capitulate, and the intense, nervous negotiations dragged on, with Tyler forcefully expressing the rebels' demands one by one. Finally, Richard agreed to the abolition of serfdom, free tenancy arrangements, a lifting of all restrictions on buying and selling, and agreed to pardon the rebels for their actions. As proof of his sincerity, Richard offered to set 30 clerks to work drawing up charters of freedom for all districts of the realm. Secure in the knowledge that the king had granted their demands, Tyler and his men entered the Tower of London. The royal guards made no attempt to halt them, and the confident rebels searched the whole building, checking every room and passage. Eventually, their search proved fruitful. The appalling Sudbury had taken refuge in a chapel, claiming he was taking Mass. In fact, he had taken 3 masses in an attempt to stall the rebels long enough to make good his escape. But the rebel soldiers finally lost their patience and dragged him to Tower Hill, where he was summarily beheaded. The treasurer Hales and the king's sergeant-at-arms were also found, and they were taken to Tower Hill to suffer the same terrible fate as Sudbury. While Wat Tyler and his men were dispatching the traitors in the Tower, the peasants' army were running riot in London, and the chronicles tell us of events with horrific accuracy.
And at the same time, the Commons made proclamation that whoever could catch any Fleming or other alien of any nation might cut off his head. And so they did after this. And then they took the heads of the archbishops and of others and put them on wooden poles and carried them before them in procession as far as the shrine of Westminster Abbey, in despite of them and God and Holy Church. And vengeance descended on them no long time after. Then they returned to London Bridge and set the head of the archbishop on the gate with 8 others they had murdered, so that all could see who passed over the bridge. This done, they went to the church of St. Martin's in the Vintry and found therein 35 Flemings whom they dragged out and beheaded in the streets. On that day were beheaded in all some 140 or 160 persons. Then they took their way to the house of the Lombards and other aliens, and broke into their dwellings and robbed them of all the goods they could lay their hands on. This went on for all that day and the following night, with hideous and horrible tumult. The next morning, Saturday, great numbers of the Commons came to Westminster Abbey at the hour of tierce, and there they found John Imworth, Marshal of the Marshalsea and Warden of the prisoners, a tormentor without pity. He was at the shrine of St. Edward's to crave aid and succour from that saint to preserve him from his enemies. But the Commons wrenched him away from the shrine and dragged him away to Cheapside and there beheaded him. And on this day, at 3 in the afternoon, the king came to the Abbey of Westminster and some 200 persons with him. And the abbot and the monks of the said abbey and the canons and vicars of St. Stephen's Chapel came to meet in procession, clothed in their copes and their feet naked. And they brought him to the high altar of the church. And the king made his prayer devoutly and left offerings for the altar and the relics. And afterwards, the king caused a proclamation to be made that all the commons of the country who were still in London should come to Smithfield to meet him there.
But as the peasant army satisfied its burning desire for revenge, its fortunes were taking a distinct turn for the worse. For the king's request for a meeting at Smithfield had sinister and ominous overtones. Quite simply, the royal party planned to lure Tyler into a private conference where he would be seized and murdered. The Smithfield meeting was a carefully planned, murderous trap.
When Richard met the rebels at Mile End, he made a series of promises to them, including, most obviously, charters of pardon and charters of remission from serfdom. What happened in the following 24 hours is uncertain, but it would seem that the King's Council, which had been in a kind of paralysis up until that point, finally pulled together, and that certain individuals there, probably figures like the Earls of Arundel and Oxford and Salisbury and Suffolk, convinced Richard, or went behind Richard's back, and planned military vengeance against the rebels.
The meeting at Smithfield was a turning point in the peasants' revolt. It is difficult to believe that Tyler had no suspicions at all as to the king's motives for a private meeting. Perhaps he was a victim of the carelessness that overconfidence can bring. He approached the king with a swagger and proceeded to outline a list of new demands. This time his target was the church, which Tyler demanded should be stripped of its powers, leaving all men answerable to the king's laws alone. That all men be free and equal before the law, and that the law should no longer be able to enforce outlawry on anyone. King Richard listened intently as Tyler made his long speech, and then answered coolly and calmly that all his demands would be met. But first the rebel soldiers must stop the killings and return to their homes. It was now that a dramatic and famous scene unfolded. Tyler called for a draught of ale, which he swigged down in front of the king. In the age of chivalry, this was an unforgivable insult to the monarch, and it presented the royal party with an ideal opportunity. As Tyler drank, a young page rushed forward, crying out in a loud voice that Tyler was the greatest thief and robber in Kent. Tyler demanded satisfaction for the insult and fatally drew his dagger. As the steel blade flashed in the sunlight, William Walworth, the Lord Mayor of London, rushed forward to write his name in the pages of English history. Declaring Tyler arrested, he and his men closed around the peasant leader who now realized he had fallen into a trap. For Tyler, the end had come and he was struck down by swords and daggers, his mutilated body falling only 40 paces from the king. The rebel army, waiting for their leader to return, grew suspicious. Now the king played his key part in the plan by approaching the rebel army and crying out that Tyler had been knighted for his deeds. He ordered the army to march to St. John's Fields, where Tyler would meet them. Amid some confusion, the peasants obeyed their king and began their march towards the fields. Meanwhile, Walworth rode into London and called on the aldermen there to muster a force for the defence of the king, who, he assured them, was surrounded by the rebels. The men of the 24 wards of London frantically came together to save the life of their king. Before long, the royalist army had mustered some 3,000 troops who were placed under the command of Sir Robert Knollys. This small army now ran to the northwest gate of London to prepare an ambush for the rebel army, who were approaching the city walls preparing to greet their leader, Tyler. Knollys and his army quickly seized the initiative, and before they could respond, the rebel army was surrounded and overpowered. The frightened and confused peasants could only watch in horror as the Lord Mayor, Walworth, rode towards them in triumph, brandishing the head of Wat Tyler. Triumph had quickly turned into disaster. With their revered leader dead, morale and resolve in the peasant army wilted visibly. The Earl of Salisbury came forward to assure the peasants that their hard-won concessions would still be met, and he urged them to disperse and go home. Almost pathetically, the simple common folk believed him. With heavy hearts, they gradually turned towards their country homes and villages. With the threat to London and to the king diminished, the royal army quickly regained control of the city, and reprisals began almost immediately. As they journeyed home, erstwhile rebels were rounded up and put to death. Ironically, many were executed at Cheapside, where only a few days earlier rebel leaders had beheaded so many in the name of the rebellion. With London secured, the King's Council turned their attention to the counties. They sent out urgent calls to rally to the royal standard on Blackheath. Hundreds of lords with their men gathered there, emerging from the hiding places that had seen them safe during the rebellion. By the 18th, a large enough force had been gathered to enable the council to proclaim the arrest of all malefactors and the dispersal of all unruly groups. On the 22nd of June, the force entered Waltham, where Richard raised his standard. Nearby was the last remnants of the rebel army pledged to fight to the death to preserve the rights they had won. A deputation from the rebel army was sent to meet the king, with demands for the ratification of the charters he had granted and the rights that these afforded. The venom and vehemence of the council response was exposed in the words of King Richard. "O most vile and odious by land and sea, you who are not worthy to live when compared with the lords whom you have attacked, you should be forthwith punished with the vilest deaths, were it not for the office you bear. Go back to your comrades and bear the king's answer. You were and are serfs, and shall remain in bondage, not that of old, but one infinitely worse, more vile without comparison." The king also forswore all connection with the rebels and forbade the use of his name to support their crimes. In fear of their lives, the deputation was dismissed from the royal presence in order to convey the message to the rebel camp at Billericay. For the last brave men of the rebel army, the moment of truth had arrived. Almost suicidally, they reaffirmed their sworn intention to enjoy the privileges they had won or die in the attempt. And so preparations were made for a last-ditch stand at Billericay. On the 28th of June 1381, the royal host drew up its forces before the rebel camp. Both sides ignored the normal conventions of war, and as their frustration and anger boiled over, the royal army bore down mercilessly onto the rebels, most of whom had never seen warfare in their lives. The fighting was sharp and bloody, as the royal army smashed the rebel defences in one charge and sent the defenders fleeing in terror. Many were cut down in the terrible pursuit which followed. Over 500 peasants were killed, and many more were caught and executed as punishment for their treason. The fate of the rebellion was now sealed, and all over the country risings were put down as loyal men flocked to the king's cause. On July the 2nd, a proclamation was issued officially revoking all the charters issued at Mile End, clearing the way for a judicial inquiry. As England slowly returned to normal, officials such as Belknap returned to their duties, gaining evidence of crimes against the government and administering the poll tax. The government certainly had no intention of letting the architects and perpetrators of the rebellion go unpunished. The trials, which took place in London, Essex and Kent, saw hundreds of people hanged in the name of the king, although very few gave evidence against their fellow citizens. However, the vicious judicial reprisals offered a splendid opportunity for the settlement of grudges and personal enmities, and it is known that many innocent people went to the gallows. And what of John Ball, whose teachings and sermons had provided the spark for the Great Rebellion? Arrested at Coventry and brought before his accusers on July the 13th, 1381, Ball proudly acknowledged his part in the struggle, declared he had no regrets, and flatly refused to ask for a pardon. 2 days later, on July 15th, he suffered the barbarous fate of those accused of treason. He was hung, drawn and quartered, and his dismembered body sent to the four corners of England. At last, on the 30th of August, King Richard issued a proclamation deferring judgment of offenders to their local courts, and the reign of judicial terror was at an end.
The Peasants' Revolt was a unique event, and nothing of the same dimensions occurred at any other time in the Middle Ages. And because of that, it's really quite difficult to establish what its consequences really were. It's often been suggested that the only real result of the Peasants' Revolt was the abandonment of the poll tax. But in a longer and perhaps an accidental or incidental sense, the century after the Peasants' Revolt did in fact see many of the demands of the rebels in 1381 becoming a reality, most obviously as a result of the great change in the social and economic structure during that period. The conditions of life of ordinary people in England improved enormously.
The Peasants' Revolt had been crushed by a combination of duplicity, treachery, and superior force. For a few brief, glorious days, Wat Tyler and his army of commoners had bathed in the warm glow of new hope. Now the dream had gone. Villains returned to break their backs on the land, and heartless lords and poor government once more thrived in English society. But although the rebellion had failed, King Richard's unhappy reign was constantly blighted by the seething discontent of his subjects. So it was that the spirit of the great Peasants' Revolt of 1381 lived on.
Since the defeat of England by the Normans in 1066, every king who sat upon the throne had been detested by his conquered subjects, who loathed and resented their foreign rulers. To change this, it took a man of the spellbinding charisma of Richard I. Richard was absent during most of his reign fighting abroad, and when he did come home, he could not speak English, and only stayed long enough to raise more taxes so he could resume his campaigning. Yet despite this, he was universally adored and became a folk hero to his people, even crossing into the world of mythology as a symbol of hope and goodness in the legendary tales of Robin Hood. In unraveling fact from fiction regarding the man nicknamed the Lionheart because of his bravery, historians have taken differing views of him. In the 19th century, Bishop Stubbs decided he was a bad king. His ambition was that of a mere warrior. He would fight for anything whatever, but he would sell everything that was worth fighting for. Yet in this century, Barlow, the English medievalist, declared him a great man. Perhaps too great a man, shrewd in politics and also capable of diplomacy on a grand scale. Winston Churchill, himself a soldier and statesman, took the balanced view that he was, in politics, a child. The advantages gained for him by military genius were flung away by military ineptitude. His life was one magnificent parade, which when ended, left only an empty plain. A useful description of him is given by a contemporary Muslim chronicler called Bah ad-Din, who says that Richard was
a man of great courage and spirit. He had fought great battles and showed a burning passion for war. His kingdom and standing were inferior to those of the French king, but his wealth, reputation, and valor were greater. To gain his ends, he uses now soft words, now violent deeds. God alone was able to save us from his malice. Never had we had to face a subtler or a bolder opponent.
Richard was born on the 8th of September 1157 in Oxford, into a fractious family which ruled the Angevin Empire, extending from the Scots border to the Pyrenees. His father, King Henry II, imprisoned his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, for taking his children's side in a rebellion against him. Richard was his second surviving son, and he quarrelled with his brothers as well as with his parents. His younger brother John was to prove a particular thorn in his side in later years. During his infancy, Richard was fostered out to the care of a wet nurse in St Albans, whose son Alexander Neckham was born the same night, and in his adult life became a famous encyclopedist and student of magnetism. The young prince grew into a youth of great stature and fine physique, with the customary reddish gold hair of the Plantagenet dynasty. Known for his athletic prowess and his ability in combat, he was also a distinguished poet and musician. Indeed, his fondness for music led him to conduct the choir in his own private chapel. In the June of 1172, at the age of 14, Richard was formally installed as Duke of Aquitaine. 2 years later, he was at odds with his father when the king decreed that on his death the bulk of his estate would go to his eldest son, Henry. Richard would retain Aquitaine, and Geoffrey, the youngest, would succeed to Brittany by means of an arranged marriage. John was allotted nothing, hence his nickname Lackland. The princes, knowing that they were being fobbed off with titles but no real power, joined together in a conspiracy against their father, and Eleanor of Aquitaine disguised herself as a man in order to travel to Paris and take part in the plot. Unfortunately, she was captured and kept in prison by her husband for the rest of her life. Richard only surrendered when the king marched to Poitou, ready to do battle against him. Richard's reputation was really established in May 1179, after his capture of the castle of Tyburg, which was reputedly impregnable. And when his elder brother Henry died of dysentery in 1183, the Lionheart believed himself to be the obvious choice as heir to the throne. The turning point in Richard's life came in 1187. On the 7th of July, Muslim forces in Palestine crushed their Christian enemies at the Battle of Hattin. A contemporary account of this conflict exists in the Itinerarium Regis Ricardi, written by a canon named Richard, resident of the Augustan Priory of the Holy Trinity in London.
So many were slain, so many wounded, and so many thrown into chains that our people, completely destroyed, were a pitiable sight even to the enemy. Worse still, the cross of our salvation, that life-giving wood, was taken into the hands of the enemy, and along with it fell its bearers. Some of the captives, and their numbers were as amazing as they were pitiable, were kept unharmed to await the victor's will. The rest were dispatched to heaven in a swift and merciful death by the murderer's sword. Among others, Reynold of Chatillon, Lord of Ultra-Jourdain, was brought before Sultan Saladin. The tyrant, driven by rage, or possibly out of respect for such a great man, struck off that proud and venerable head with his own hand. All the Templars, with the exception of their master, he ordered to be beheaded, determined to wipe them out completely, for he knew their reputation for superiority in battle. Then, what a passionate rivalry of faith and courage ensued. Many of the captives, claiming to be Templars, vied together in a rush towards the butchers. Gladly they offered their necks to the swordsman under a holy pretense. When the noise of battle had ceased, and Saladin beheld the captives being dragged away and the dead strewn about, he raised his eyes to heaven and thanked God for the victory, as he always did when things went well for him.
On the 2nd of October, the anniversary of Muhammad's ascent into heaven, the Muslims marched on the holy city of Jerusalem, again under the leadership of Al-Malik al-Nazir Saladin Yusuf, better known as Saladin. Bahadin paints this picture of the infidel commander.
Saladin was sociable, well-mannered and entertaining. He could recite by heart the genealogies and battles of the Arab tribes and knew all their exploits. He could even recall the genealogies of their horses. In addition, he had studied the curiosities and wonders of the world. He would put his friends at ease and raise their spirits. The purity of Saladin's character was always evident. When in company, he would allow no one to be spoken ill of, preferring to hear only of their good traits. I never saw him disposed to insult anyone. He always stuck to his promises and was loyal. He continued to behave in this way until the day that God called him to the seat of his grace and mercy.
Such was the success of this paragon of virtue that by the end of the year only the coastal towns of Tyre, Tripoli and Antioch remained under Christian control. In his Itinerarium, Canon Richard of Holy Trinity laments the fall of Jerusalem thus.
A bitter day it was, the day on which the people left the holy place and went their different ways into exile. On that day, the queen of all the world's cities was taken into bondage, and the inheritance of her sons brought under the yoke of strangers. After Jerusalem had been handed over, a Muzan climbed the high mountain Calvary, and there, where Christ on his cross put an end to the law of death, the proclamation of a bastard law rang out.
As soon as he heard this news, and without consulting his father, Richard took the cross, pledging to go on a crusade to free the Holy Land from the hands of the infidel. As well as the promise of military glory, taking the cross offered what was known as a plenary indulgence, promising the crusader freedom from purgatory and guaranteeing eternal life in heaven. Bernard of Clairvaux, a saint of the 12th century, gives the following exhortation.
O mighty soldier, O man of war, you now have a cause for which you can fight without endangering your soul, a cause in which to win is glorious, and for which to die is but gain. Or are you a shrewd businessman, a man quick to see the profits of this world? If you are, I can offer you a splendid bargain. Do not miss this opportunity. Take the sign of the cross. At once you will have indulgence for all the sins which you confess with a contrite heart. It does not cost you much to buy, and if you wear it with humility, you will find it is worth the kingdom of heaven.
However, Richard could not blithely set off for Palestine without first sorting out his domestic affairs. First of all, a tax called the Saladin tithe was levied to finance his intended expedition. Then he went to France to attend a conference at Bonmoulin, designed to establish peace in Europe while her rulers were away. Richard was concerned that in his absence his father would give his title of Duke of Aquitaine to his brother John. To forestall this, he persuaded King Philip of France to issue a joint declaration that Richard should be married to the French king's sister Alice, and then be declared heir to the throne of England. King Henry refused. In response to this, Richard knelt and did homage to Philip for all the Angevin lands in France, thus subjugating them to the French king. Such an act was tantamount to a declaration of war against his father, who regarded these lands as the powerhouse of his own kingdom. In June 1189, Richard and Philip invaded Henry's French territory in a last act of rebellion which only ended with the English king's death. On the 20th of July, Richard was invested as ruler of Normandy before crossing to England, where he declared an amnesty and released many prisoners, including his mother. 6 weeks later, he was crowned king in Westminster Abbey. The coronation of Richard I is significant insofar as a contemporary chronicler left a detailed account of it, which is the first evidence we have of what the ceremony consisted of. There is also a record of the music which was played. We are told that the king was escorted to the high altar in Westminster Abbey along a path of woolen cloth. The procession consisted of the clergy, led by the priors, the abbots and the bishops carrying crosses, candles and holy water. Amongst the bishops were 4 barons carrying golden candelabra. After them came the highest nobles in the land, carrying variously the king's cap of state, the golden spurs, the sceptre and the swords of state. They were followed by 6 barons holding the royal robes and insignia. The crown was carried by the Earl of Essex, and Richard, flanked by 2 bishops, followed this. He was shaded by a silk canopy, and behind him walked the rest of the laity. At the altar, the king took the coronation oath, swearing to observe peace, honour and reverence towards God, and to exercise right justice over his subjects. After this, he was stripped to his breeches and shirt and anointed, an action which conferred on him the divine sanction for his kinship. This moment, rather than the placing of the crown upon his head, was the key moment in the service. As soon as the coronation was over, the new king set about in earnest to raise money for his planned crusade. Indeed, he is reported to have said,
"I would sell London if I could find anyone rich enough to buy it."
The preparations were extensive and lengthy. Richard and his followers spent Christmas in Normandy. He founded a house of Austin canons in Poitou as a kind of spiritual insurance policy, then proceeded to Vexilla, where he had a rendezvous with Philip of France. It was noted that the first time the king leant on his pilgrim's staff, it broke beneath his weight, an incident that filled his superstitious followers with anxiety. Prior to his departure, to placate his brother John Lackland, King Richard gave him the administration of 6 counties and the profits which accrued from them. This done on the 4th of July 1190, which was the 3rd anniversary of the Battle of Hattin, what became known as the Third Crusade was launched. Richard had paid 5,850 silver marks to the Genoese for the hire of their fleet to take his troops to Outremer, as Palestine was known. The ships were 3 weeks late arriving, so instead the king led his army to Marseille and there hired 30 boats to take his army to Genoa. Philip of France went overland, and the 2 kings met in the Italian city. There Philip asked if he could borrow 5 of Richard's vessels to convey his troops, and the English king grudgingly offered him 3. This precipitated the first of many disagreements between the 2 men. From Genoa, Richard made a leisurely progress south, down the coast, pausing to do some sightseeing at Ostia, Naples and Salerno, until in October the Crusaders, led by Richard, entered Messina. An eyewitness account sets the scene.
The populace rushed out eagerly to behold him, crowding along the shore, and lo, on the horizon they saw a fleet of innumerable galleys, and then far off they could hear the shrill sound of trumpets. As the galleys came nearer, they could see that they were painted in different colours and hung with shields glittering in the sun. They could make out standards and pennons fixed to the spearheads fluttering in the breeze. Around the ships, the sea boiled as the oarsmen drove them onwards. Then, with trumpet peals ringing in their ears, the onlookers beheld what they had been waiting for. The King of England, magnificently dressed and standing on a raised platform so that he could see and be seen.
The inhabitants of Messina were hostile to the Crusaders, inflating the prices of necessary supplies to such a degree that by the 4th of October Richard was ready to seize the town. Canon Richard of Holy Trinity in London gives this report.
On the 4th of October, Richard I of England captured Messina without a single thought, in less time than a priest would have taken to sing matins. And many more citizens would have perished, had not the king in his mercy given orders to spare them. But who can estimate the quantity of wealth they lost? The victors seized for their own use all the gold, silver, and valuables they could find. They also fired the galleys, reducing them to ashes, to prevent the citizens from escaping to fight again. They even seized some of the noble women for themselves. Suddenly, after all this, the French noticed Richard's flags and standards flying above the walls and ramparts of the city. At this, the King of France, Philip II, was outraged, conceiving feelings of jealousy which were to endure all his life.
Having taken Messina, the Crusaders wintered in Sicily. An insight into the Lionheart's character was given at this time, for records show that he did penance for vice under the direction of a hermit called Joachim of Fiore. 5 years later, on Easter Tuesday 1195, further evidence of what were probably the king's homosexual tendencies is shown. Richard fell ill, and a churchman was called to attend him. The cleric reminded him of the fate which befell Sodom, and begged him to put aside his unlawful deeds. The king again did public penance, made great show of recalling his wife, and was cured of his illness. However, in Sicily in 1190, he was not yet married, although he had been betrothed to Alice, sister of Philip of France, for some years, a fact that was a further bone of contention between the two kings. This matter was complicated when Eleanor of Aquitaine arrived in Messina, bringing with her Berengaria of Navarre as a prospective bride for her son. Richard pledged himself to Berengaria, a lady of beauty and good sense, and in April his armies set off on the second leg of their journey to the Holy Land, taking with them not only the king's new fiancée, but also a portable castle called Matagriffon, which could be erected as and when required. Within 3 days, the fleet was caught in a storm, and the ship in which Berengaria was sailing was washed off course to Cyprus. The island was under the rule of Emperor Isaac Comnenus, an ally of Saladin. A Norman minstrel called Ambroise, who wrote an account of the crusade in his ballad Histoire de la Guerre Sainte, says of the relationship between these two that,
"And it was told of them as fact, that they had sealed their friendship's pact by drinking one another's blood."
This made the emperor a potentially dangerous host for the poor princess, and Richard was swift to come to her rescue. He arrived at Limassol on the 6th of May, and before the sun was up had Isaac and his retinue surrounded. Realizing that resistance was impossible, the emperor signed a treaty under terms dictated by the Lionheart. The capture of Cyprus was strategically vital for the Crusaders, as they were dependent on sea power for supplies and reinforcements, and the island provided an important staging post and source of both. Perhaps as a celebration, on the 12th of May, Richard and Berengaria were married in Limassol. Important alliances were sealed between various factions in the crusading army at this time. There were two rival claimants to the throne of Jerusalem, King Guy of Lusignan, whom Saladin had deposed and who was now laying siege to Acre, and a protege of Philip of France, whose name was Conrad de Montferrat. Both claimed the crown through their marriages to two sisters, Sibylla and Isabella. Because Philip was openly supporting Montferrat, Richard chose this moment to publicly align himself with Guy de Lusignan. He sailed from Cyprus to Famagusta, Margat, then Tyre, before reaching Acre to help his new ally in his siege of the town. The mechanics of warfare in the 12th century generally favoured the defenders, and the Muslims in Acre were armed with Greek fire, which was a compound based on naphtha, which exploded on impact, which they put into containers and launched at their opponents. While the naphtha rained down on them, the Crusaders were obliged to fill in the moat before they could make an attempt on the walls of the town. They had only their cumbersome catapults, although they made extensive use of undermining, digging beneath the city to weaken its structure to the point of collapse. At one stage, Richard offered a gold piece to anyone who could bring him a stone from the walls. Conditions were harsh. Canon Richard of Holy Trinity in London reports that
the food shortage came to a crisis. Stomachs once belching from overindulgence were now rumbling with emptiness, which they tried to assuage with a voracity made indiscriminate by weakness. All supplies had been used up, and the hunger of the troops was still unsatisfied, exacerbated by the absence of bare necessities, and made even more irritating by the lack of their accustomed luxuries. Hot weather added no little peril to the prospect of famine. But what more can be said? A measure of wheat small enough to tuck under your arm was selling for 100 pieces of gold. A fowl for 12 shillings. Horses' guts were sold for 10 shillings, and an egg for 6pence.
The shortage of food had obvious side effects. Both Richard and Philip of France are reported to have become ill with a fever that made their hair and nails fall out, probably scurvy. Saladin, with great courtesy, sent them fruits and other delicacies to speed their recovery, and Richard dispatched to him a young Negro by way of thanks. This action was evidently interpreted as treacherous with hindsight. For 5 years later, Richard wrote to the Emperor of Germany.
Acre taken, 2 battles won, an abundance of rich spoils, with which the world is witness I have not enriched myself, indicates sufficiently, without my saying so, that I have never spared Saladin. Savien! I have received from him small presents as fruit and similar things, which the Saracen, no less commendable for his politeness and generosity than for his valour and conduct, hath sent to me from time to time. The King of France receives some as well as myself. And these are civilities, which brave men during war perform one towards another, without ill consequences.
The same admiration that Richard showed towards his opponent is echoed in the words of one of his followers, talking about the enemy.
What can we say of this race of infidels who thus defended their city? Never were there braver soldiers than these, the honour of their nation. If only they had been of the true faith, it would not have been possible anywhere in the world to find men to surpass them.
When Acre fell to the Crusaders on the 12th of July 1191, Saladin agreed to return his prisoners and pay a large amount of money. However, he failed to meet the deadline for this set by Richard, and despite their mutual respect, in an action which resonated as Saladin's massacre of the Christians at Hattin, Richard ordered that all the 2,700 Muslims held by his men be put to the sword. At this time, a deal was negotiated between Guy of Lusignan and Conrad of Montferrat, whereby the former would be king of Jerusalem for the rest of his life, to be succeeded by the latter, and that they would jointly share the revenues from the city. This agreement secured, and because he was worried about his affairs at home, King Philip announced that he was returning to France, a decision that the English, who were prepared to see the fighting through to the end, viewed askance. Meanwhile, Richard hoped to march on Jerusalem to crown his campaign with the ultimate glory of liberating the holy city. His soldiers kept closed ranks and marched near to the shore for protection, while Saladin's army shadowed them along a parallel course. They stopped for a parley that proved fruitless, and when he arrived at Assouf, Saladin decided to attack. In a stupendous victory, the Lionheart finally put paid to the myth of the infidels' invincibility, winning for himself great personal glory. One of his soldiers describes how.
There the king, the fierce, the extraordinary king, cut down the Turks in every direction, and none could escape the force of his arm.
For wherever he turned, brandishing his sword, he carved a wide path for himself, cutting them down like a reaper with his sickle. And in his poem Histoire de la Guerre Sainte, the minstrel Ambroise recalls the scene in boasting vein.
Well, I can recount that neither rain, nor snow, nor sleet in winter's depth did ever beat, more thickly or more densely fly, many can tell ye if I lie, than did the foeman shafts which flew upon us and our horses slew.
He goes on to describe the charge of the Crusaders' cavalry, revelling in how
their soldiers stood aghast, for we descended on the foes like thunder, and great dust arose. Then ye had seen bearded Turks lie slain, as thick and close as sheaves of grain.
the Crusaders began to march towards Jaffa, which was the nearest port to Jerusalem. A more leisurely atmosphere prevailed, and Richard was joined by his sister and his queen. At about this time, he sent home a report of his activities, and warned that before long he would be returning to his kingdom himself.
Richard, the King of England, to the Justiciar of England, greetings. You should know that we have suffered much from sickness since the start of our expedition. But by the mercy, le bon Dieu, we recover fully. You know well enough how much honor was vouchsafed us through divine compassion to Messina. Thereafter, while continuing our journey, we turned aside to Cyprus, where our people who had suffered shipwreck hoped to find shelter. But a tyrant there, Isaac Comnenus, had usurped to himself the title of emperor. Fearing neither le bon Dieu nor man, he advanced with a strongly armored force to prevent us from landing. He inflicted additional suffering on men whose ships had been wrecked by plundering and imprisoning them with the intention of letting them perish from starvation. It is easy to understand to what anger we were aroused to punish such villainy. Supported by divine aid, we engaged this enemy in battle and gained a quick victory. We now have the enemy leader beaten and bound as our prisoner, as well as his only daughter. And we have taken control of Cyprus with all its fortifications. Then, in a cheerful and confident mood, we entered the harbor of Acre. Within a short period of our arrival and that of the French king, we regained Acre and the Holy Cross, taking 1,700 prisoners. However, the French king left us after 15 days to return to his own country. We, on the other hand, are more concerned with the love and honor due to God than an audacious interest in the acquisition even of many territories. Nevertheless, as soon as we have restored the territory of Syria to its original status, we shall return home. So you can assume that we will enter home waters next Lent. We are also instructing you to pay special attention to the furtherance of our interest, witnessed by me at Acre.
Once again, the king tried negotiating with Saladin, who was often represented by his brother Adil Safedin, or Safaddin, who proved to be another cunning opponent. The Saracens parleyed separately with Conrad and Richard, thus fostering an attitude of wariness and mistrust within the Christian camp. Richard began by asking for the return of Jerusalem and the land which lay west of the River Jordan, but Saladin riposted that it was impossible for him to cede the holy city. So Richard parried by suggesting that Saladin grant the lands of Palestine to his brother Safaddin, who could then be married to Richard's sister Joan, uniting the warring parties in a solid alliance. He offered to include the coastal ports as dowry for the match. Rather surprisingly, Saladin accepted the deal, wrong-footing the king who hadn't expected him to, so that Richard was forced to raise objections to his own proposal. He said that Joan was reluctant to marry an infidel and would Safaddin consider converting to Christianity. At a later stage, he put forward his niece, Eleanor of Brittany, as an alternative candidate. But in fact, a treaty was never agreed upon. Indeed, the negotiations seem to have been conducted in a light-hearted manner, as though the two leaders were merely intent on sizing one another up, not in ending the conflict. The Christians continued to advance slowly towards Jerusalem through the autumn, and by December they were camped at Beit Nuba, only 12 miles from the city. It was becoming increasingly apparent to the king that even if he succeeded in capturing Jerusalem from the Muslims, the difficulties of holding it, thousands of miles from home, with weary soldiers and poor supplies, would be legion. At a council meeting in January 1192, the decision was taken to retreat. A contemporary report talks of Richard standing on the heights of Nebi Samil, overlooking Jerusalem, and covering his eyes so as not to gaze upon the city he was unable to liberate. In appalling conditions of rain and hail, the Christian army began its retreat through the mud to Ascalon on the 20th of January 1192. The poet Ambroise laments,
"Every pilgrim cursed the day when he into the world was born."
The divisions within the Crusaders became acute when the remaining French contingent under Conrad of Montferrat decided to go north to Tyre, leaving the English faction alone in Ascalon to bear the brunt of Saladin's continued forays. Resentments grew. Ambroise heard reports that their recalcitrant allies
danced through the late hours of night, their heads bedecked with flowers, entwined with garlands and in crown. Beside wine casks they sat them down, and drank until matins had rung, then homewards made their way among the harlots.
While this was going on, the English were forced to rebuild stone by stone the fortifications of Ascalon, razed to the ground by Saladin. Even the king lent a hand. He also continued to negotiate with the enemy. Realizing that it was impossible to resolve the fate of Jerusalem, he was determined to make at least the coastal ports secure. He needed to settle his business in the Holy Land and start for home, as his brother John was making trouble for him in England, and Philip of France, back in Europe once more, was threatening his borders in Normandy. However, if Conrad of Montferrat and Guy of Lusignan continued to bicker, Palestine would remain in turmoil and be vulnerable to recapture by the Muslims. Therefore, the king sought to resolve the differences between the two men once and for all. On the 16th of April 1192, the matter was put before the Army Council, which was asked to choose the new leader. They selected Conrad. So by way of compensation, Richard made Guy the Lord of Cyprus. Almost immediately, events took an unexpected turn. Before he could be crowned, Conrad of Montferrat was assassinated. Canon Richard of the Holy Trinity Order in London relates how.
He was peacefully making his way home, very happy and joking from a dinner engagement with the Bishop of Beauvais. He just reached the city toll booth when two youths, cutthroats, made a sudden attack on him. They were unencumbered by cloaks and thrust at the Marquis with the daggers they held in their hands. They penetrated his chest with these, lethally wounding him, and were ready to make a swift getaway. The Marquis immediately fell from his horse and was rolling on the ground, fatally wounded. One of the murderers was immediately cut down, while the other ran straight into the nearest church. In spite of this, he was snatched from it and dragged as a condemned man through the middle of the town until his last treacherous breath.
The men responsible for Conrad's death were probably linked to a Syrian revolutionary religious movement. But but the confession of one of them is said to have implicated Richard in the killing. Pressure was piling up on the king as news from home brought further indications that John was up to no good. Richard suffered a nervous collapse. Anxiously, his chaplain, William of Poitou, attempted to rally him.
All agree, O king, that you are the father, the champion and defender of Christendom. If you desert God's peoples now, they will be destroyed by the enemy.
Richard seemed to respond to treatment and announced that he would stay in the Holy Land until the following Easter. On the 7th of June, the Crusaders again marched to Beit Nuba, where they again had to confront the fact that they would be unable to take Jerusalem. A month later, they began to withdraw to the coast, continuing the cycle of victory and defeat in various minor skirmishes. Saladin captured Jaffa at the end of July, but was then trounced by Richard in response. On the night of the 4th of August, the Muslims made a surprise attack on the Christians, and once again the king acquitted himself inspirationally.
We are told he was a giant in battle and was everywhere in the field, now here, now there, wherever the attacks of the Turks raged most fiercely. On that day his sword shone like lightning, and many of the Turks felt its edge. Some were cloven in two from their helmet to their teeth. Others lost their heads, arms and other limbs, lopped off at a single blow. Whoever felt one of his blows had no need of a second.
Although he could still stage a magnificent fight when required, the Lionheart was unwell and tired. On the 2nd of September, he at last agreed a truce with Saladin that was affirmed by the marriage of the widow of Conrad, Isabella, whose claim to the throne of Jerusalem nobody disputed, to Richard's nephew, Henry of Champagne. In October, the king set sail for England. The impact he had upon the Holy Land was so strong that even centuries after his death, custom has it, when Arab women wanted to quieten their children, they used the words, "Hush, England is coming." Canon Richard takes up the tale of the king's journey home.
On the 11th of November, King Richard, exhausted by the long, rough sea voyage, landed at the earliest opportunity on the first land that came into sight, which was a place called Corfu, ruled by Constantinople. Happening to fall in with some pirates, he wisely agreed to pay them whatever they asked to transfer him to some safer shore. Leaving the royal fleet, he put off his kingly garments and boldly entrusted his life to savage pirates. He changed his clothes, but not his spirit. For what would he not dare, great-hearted King Richard? With 4 companions, he sailed across to Slavonia, and thence to Aquileia, entering the territory of Duke Leopold of Austria. There, in Vienna, on the 20th of December, 1192, he was taken prisoner.
Ever since the English had torn down his standard outside Acre, Leopold of Austria had resented Richard. This hostility turned to hatred when the English king was implicated in the murder of Leopold's cousin, Conrad of Montferrat. Therefore, it must have been with some delight that the Duke learnt of Richard's presence in Austria. He was swift to imprison him in Dürnstein Castle, overlooking the River Danube. To the politicians of Europe, the English king was a valuable commodity, and there were many who would have taken over the role of his jailer for a price. After hard bargaining, Leopold gave his prize into the hands of the German emperor, who agreed the handsome sum of 75,000 marks, also promising to give a 50,000 mark dowry to Eleanor of Brittany on her marriage to one of the Duke's sons. The German emperor wrote exultantly to Philip of France, "Inasmuch as he is now in our power and has always done his utmost to annoy and disturb you, we have thought it right to notify your highness, for we know that these tidings will bring you the most abundant joy." In the meantime, Richard was also firing off letters. He wrote to the Emperor, who was also a cousin of Conrad of Montferrat, denying any involvement in the murder of the Marquis, in the hope of securing his own release from prison.
The assassination of the Marquis de Montferrat is foreign to my character. I have not hitherto evinced such dread of my enemies as man should believe me capable of attacking their lives otherwise than with sword and hand.
Philip of France broke the news of his capture to Richard's brother John in England. The prince raced to France to do homage to Philip for Normandy and all of Richard's other French lands, hoping to win the king as an ally. Returning to England, John began to stir up rebellion, attempting to enlist the help of the Welsh and the Scots. He made strongholds for himself at Wallingford and Windsor, then declared Richard dead and himself king. Richard's loyal followers summoned a great council of the realm on the 28th of February 1193, as a result of which 2 abbots were posted abroad to look for him. Legend has it that the minstrel Blondel finally ran the king to earth by travelling all round the continent singing his master's favourite ballads, until he heard an answering song from deep within a dungeon. There is no doubt that Richard himself made compositions while he was held prisoner. The most famous surviving example of these is Ya nu en prie.
Certes, will no prisoner tell his tale fitly unless as one whom woes befall. Still, as a solace, songs may much avail. Friends I have many, yet the gifts are small. Shame that because to ransom me they fail, I've pined 2 years in thrall. But all my liege men in fair Normandy, in England, Poitou, Gascony, know well that not my meanest follower would I leave for gold's sake in prison house to dwell. Who reproach I, neither kinsman or ally, yet I am still in thrall.
The 2 abbots sent from England found Richard on his way to answer charges brought against him by the German Emperor Henry and Duke Leopold. He dealt with their accusations so effectively that the emperor was moved to give him what he called the kiss of peace. The terms of the king's ransom were set. Richard was to pay 150,000 marks, which was the equivalent to 3 times his annual income, and amounted to 34 tons in silver. On his mother's advice, he resigned England to the emperor in order to receive it back as a fief of the empire. This made him a vassal of Philip for his lands in France and a vassal of the emperor for England. Hearing the ransom was fixed, Philip of France wrote to Prince John to warn him of his brother's imminent return. "Look to yourself, the devil is loosed." Meanwhile, Saladin fared no better than his former opponent, meeting an early death in the March of 1193. Bahadin writes movingly that
never had our faith and his true believers suffered such a loss as befell them when the Sultan died. The whole world was filled with a grief so profound that only God could realize its true depth. I have heard people say that they would be prepared to sacrifice their life for that of someone dear to them. And I had always thought that if they were to be confronted with such a choice, they would soon recant these words. But on that day, if I and others had been asked who will lay down his life in exchange for the Sultan's, I am convinced that each of us would willingly have done so.
Richard landed in Sandwich on the 14th of March 1194 and soon returned England to law and order. One of the rebels who had been working on John's behalf is reputed to have died of fright on hearing of the king's return. Richard was obliged to storm the outer walls of Nottingham Castle before its inmates would believe that he was really home, after which he spent a pleasant day in Sherwood Forest. His brother he dealt with leniently, saying to him,
Don't be afraid, John. You are a child. You have got into bad company, and it is those who have led you astray who will be punished.
Having been absent for so long, many problems were waiting to be dealt with, most of them financial. The crusade, the fighting in France, famine and the king's ransom had brought the country near to financial collapse. Richard raised money by having a new Great Seal cut and declaring all documents issued under the old one null and void. It was a pursuit of money that indirectly led the Lionheart to his death. In September 1199, near Chaloux in the Limousin, a peasant ploughing his land found a treasure trove that consisted of 4 golden figures of an emperor and his family seated round a table. There was also a considerable quantity of gold coins with the statues. The local landowner, Achard of Chaloux, laid claim to it. Then Viscount Amer of Limoges claimed his right as overlord and said it belonged to him, before Richard, as the Viscount's overlord, staked his claim. The king was prepared to back his words with deeds and crossed over to Chaloux and laid siege to the village. One day, near the walls of the castle, Richard spotted a man armed with a crossbow taking aim at him. And with characteristic bravado, before taking avoiding action, the king paused to applaud the man. The gesture cost him his life, for he was hit in the shoulder and refused to take any treatment for it, preferring to continue with the work in hand. He captured the town, but by that time the wound had become gangrenous, and King Richard the Lionheart died of blood poisoning on the 6th of April, 1199. Some remarks his old enemy Saladin made about him in 1192 are perhaps the best summing up of Richard's character.
I have long since been aware that your king is a man of honor and very brave, but he is imprudent and indeed absurdly so, in the way he plunges into the midst of danger and in his reckless indifference to his own safety. For my own part, however a powerful king I might be, I would like to have wisdom and moderation rather than an excessive boldness.
Of all the early kings of England, Richard I is held in the greatest esteem, adored and revered by his countrymen in spite of his neglect of them. His passing left them feeling bereft, and this lament, composed by the troubadour Gaucelem Fedi, serves as a fitting epitaph to him.
I must tell and recount in song the greatest misfortune and sorrow that, alas, I have ever known, and which henceforth I shall always regret and lament. For the head and father of valour, the courageous and powerful king of the English, Richard, is dead. Alas, O God, what a great loss and what a great pity. What a harsh word, and how painful it is to hear it. The man who can endure this pain must indeed have a hard heart. Ah, Lord God, you are merciful, true God, true man, and the true life, have mercy. Pardon him, for he has great need of your compassion. Do not consider his sins, but remember how he was going to serve you.